Hi, everyone. Welcome to another session of Nuts and Bolts of Writing. Today, we're going to be talking to Coffee and Comics about their webcomic, Chaotic Idiots, which you can read on Webtoon. Links in description. First of all, can you tell us a little bit about Chaotic Idiots and what it's about?
Sure. Chaotic Idiots is it's sort of a coming of age story about these fae who have been brought over, not brought over, but they've been forced to flee their homelands because it collapsed, and now they are living hidden in a modern world, kind of like along the lines of something like Fables or Once Upon a Time.
Hmm. So, what kind of genre does it fall under? Is it like urban fantasy or like low fantasy? What do you think it is considered?
Um, I would say it's probably low fantasy only because it takes place in a modern world. They have things like schools and cars and jobs. So it's more along the lines of, like, let's say I have a vampire character who is a social worker.
Hmm.
So it's more of a modern setting in that way.
Hmm. And it's a little bit slice of life too, right?
Oh yeah, I would say it started out as slice of life, and then it sort of moved into like a family drama, in some ways.
Hmm. And friendship plays a very large role in your series as well.
Absolutely.
Hmm. Can you also tell us about the role that disability plays in Chaotic Idiots?
Sure. When I was growing up, uh, I was growing up in a very neurotypical world. I myself am an Aspie. I was diagnosed about 5 years ago at this point, and I saw like a lack of, like I said, neurodivergent characters. So the role it plays is more how these characters deal with the emotions of being young teenagers, and also dealing with the fact that they're not quite, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not quite, they're not average. But then
Hmm.
again, what is normal? So it's more like how they deal with day-to-day life, having a unique set of circumstances.
Hmm. And you want to show, the different aspects of disability, right? Not just, one aspect that you always see in media, which can often be stereotyped.
Absolutely. And I recently was watching Shira, and I love the character of Entrapta. I feel like Entrapta is such a is a good step in the right direction, and something that I hope that I can help to emulate too. Like, Jacob is autistic, but he doesn't necessarily encompass the entire spectrum. He's one aspect of that. So I do hope that my characters don't necessarily fall into the stereotypical, what you think of when you think of a male on the spectrum, or really anyone on the spectrum.
Hmm. So some of the stereotypes that we see in media of a male or anyone on the spectrum is someone who is not very good with expressing some of their emotions, right? Like very logical, very much like Spock from Star Trek, for example.
Yeah, it's when you look at some of the autistic characters, they're written very robotically, and Jacob is certainly not that. And if anyone's read the series, he's very in tune with his friends and his own emotions, and he shows quite a bit of that. He shows when he's happy or when he's sad or when he's excited. Like, he definitely has a full range of emotion. Adar as well. And Adar is a little bit more severe on the spectrum, but he too has his own full range of emotion.
Hmm. Exactly. Jacob is a very empathetic person, as we see in his interactions with Leroy.
Absolutely, yes, yes. Yeah, that they have a very special brotherly bond, um, and one that is is very important and crucial in their development of as characters.
Mhm. Yes, I really enjoyed how Jacob takes the initiative to understand Leroy more, and he's afraid of driving him away sometimes.
Absolutely. I really explored that in the episode Where the Darkest Fears Lie, is that Jacob is afraid that, because of the stereotypes of vampires and many light fae being afraid of vampires, Jacob often fears that Leroy will see him as a monster. And that's probably the last thing that he or anyone really um would want anyone to look at them as different or strange.
Mhm. What kind of fae are in your work, and how did you construct, the relationship between the fae and the humans in your work?
So, I was very inspired by Celtic mythology. I believe my cast consists of characters like nixies and sirens. Vampires are considered fae in my universe. I have pixies and centaurs, many things you would see in like Welsh and Gaelic mythology. And I don't quite think I've necessarily touched on the relationship between humans and fae quite yet. Um, I would say that in my world, it is forbidden for fae and humans to intermingle and to fall in love. Although that has happened, there are a few characters who are half human, Leroy being one of them.
Mhm. So
So they're more the Fae are more hidden from the human realm. They sort of have their own world where they're kind of their own little haven where they're at.
mhm. So what kind of roles do fae and, humans play in this universe? Like what is their relationship historically, and how will it change as the story progresses? Will it change?
So that's a good question. In Tier Nanak, which is my prequel series to Chaotic Idiots, I'm going to explore the aspect of the reason why the vampires the um are actually within the realm of the Fae is because humans were hunting them. They were afraid of them. Of how different they were. And Lord Ambrosio, who is like the great ancestor of the vampires, basically begged the gods of the other lands to kind of give his people sanctuary. So I would say the relationships fear based. There's a lot of like, oh, would they experiment on them? And there's definitely a fear factor there.
Mhm. So is it mostly humans who fear the fae, or as humans start fearing them and start hunting them down, the fae start becoming afraid of humans too, right?
I think the Fae have many instincts where if an all-out war were to break out with the humans, which is something that they definitely don't want, they would probably fight back to ensure the survival of their species. But the other thing is they're fighting amongst themselves. So there's really this underlying of this bubbling unrest between the light and the dark Fae.
Mhm. Can you tell us more about the light fae and the dark fae and what species they encompass?
Sure, dark fae would be considered like vampires or nightmares. And nightmares are my own fae creation. They are based off of Scandinavian mare mythology, where people believed that mares would come and give them bad dreams.
Mhm.
So, and nightmares are everything from vampire hybrids to pure. They're creatures of shadow, so they can do everything from siphoning fear to making your worst desires come true in a
Mm.
way that is like appealing. So they're not good good creatures. And the light fae would be more like the mavens, which are they're creatures of nature. The mavens or elves and pixies, and maybe even the mimics to a degree.
Mhm. Leroy is half mimic, right?
Yes, his mother was a mimic and his father was a human.
Hmm. So how does that affect the way he sees himself?
Um, he had a, and that's an aspect I have yet to explore, but Leroy definitely had a very hard time fitting in as a child. Dude, that's why he looks the way he does. Um, that's why he has the coloring and the design that he does, because he almost has 2 feet in different planes, one which is mortal and one which is human. So I imagine it would almost make him feel like an outcast, which is why probably he and Jacob got along so well.
Hmm. Yes, definitely. Jacob and Leroy share a very special bond. Can you tell us more about their friendship and how you expect their friendship to drive where the series goes? Because they are the two main characters.
Sure, yeah. At some point, I hope to explore their childhoods a bit more. Jacob himself, even though he is a vampire, is a little bit of an outcast himself. So I definitely hope to explore further what kind of led to them having the bond that they do. And as for where it goes in the future, currently in season 2, things are a little rocky with them, but hopefully going forward with the next couple episodes, they'll be able to reconcile and come back to where they were before.
Hmm. What are the other disabilities that you cover in your series?
Sure. On top of ASD, I have congenital deafness. I cover some PTSD as well as depression and anxiety, and something that you could consider close to dissociative identity disorder, but not quite, only because it's a little bit more magical.
Hmm. Can you tell us about who these characters who have these conditions are and how they struggle with these conditions?
Sure. My character with the congenital deafness is a character named Lucas Kane, and he is a Nixie. And the one thing that he struggles with is he's so a little bit backstory about him. He was inspired by A Silent Voice, which is a beautiful animated film about bullying and disability, particularly of a deaf character. And Lucas struggles with the idea that I think, and based on my research, loneliness in silence. Like he almost has a desire to hear the world, and to hear his friends and experience it. Even though he's happy and bright and he's kind, he probably struggles with the communication the most because um, it's through ASL or text, and he's also unable to speak. So that raises a bit of difficulty for him. The other characters are Elian and Levi, are um two older characters. They're in their late high school years, and they've been in foster care. They were in foster care when they were younger because their species actually went extinct during the wars in Tirnanak. So they're really the only family that they have is each other. And they were around during the late stages of the war. So it really left some emotional scars on them.
Hmm. So they have PTSD.
Yeah, they're the ones with PTSD. My last character, because I briefly talked about Adar with the autism, and Jacob as well.
Hmm.
Uh, Wither is not necessarily unable to walk, but it's not safe for him to. He has a congenital heart defect, and so it's not safe for him to be walking around. He's very fragile. He's the one he's often been in hospitals quite a bit, and there's a little bit of a personal aspect to his story. Um, so he's not been in the series much, but he will be in more episodes down the line.
Hmm. In Leroy, he struggles with anxiety and depression.
Yes, Leroy, due to his childhood circumstance, grew up dealing with some emotional problems, including depression and anxiety. And with that, that's it's part of the reason why he's always I think I made reference in one of the episodes that he's always kind of been running from the concept of genuine family and genuine love because he doesn't know how to accept that when he's never been given it.
Mhm. Yes, that is something that a lot struggle with. He's not used to it, and I think being in contact with these emotions actually makes him even more fearful because he doesn't know what that might lead to.
That's true. It's definitely and so, but even being around someone like Jacob's family, who's very open and they're a very loving family. The Faust family is incredibly loving, despite a few skeletons in their closet. They're very they're very lovely people. And they love him like a son. They love Leroy like they would their own child. But he definitely probably has a harder time accepting it from his own family rather than someone else's family.
Mhm. How about the kind of brotherly bond that he has with Jacob? Does he have some difficulty accepting affection or care from him?
Yeah, in one of my favorite episodes, Burgers and Choco Shakes, it's Leroy's birthday and Jacob wants to have a fun day with him, but it's sad. It starts out as a very sad and tense day between the two. Um Partially because Leroy's birthday, and I didn't haven't revealed this just yet, but here it is. That was the day that he was put into the foster system. So it's never a happy day for him. I would say, yeah, he probably has a harder time accepting affection, even from Jacob, who he loves dearly. And we see throughout the series how deep that love goes.
Mhm. It's very touching.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely. They're definitely probably two of the most fleshed out.
Definitely, yes. You write them so well, they feel like real live people.
Partially they were inspired by the bond between myself and one of my own very very close long close friends, so that probably had something to do with it.
Ah, I see. So who does Leroy feel like is the easiest to accept affection from?
That's the thing about his journey. I think i think before he can truly accept love and affection from anyone, he has to love and accept himself. And that's really what Leroy's story is about, is learning to love himself first and then gradually accept love from those around him who care for him deeply.
That's very true. Yeah, sometimes when you don't accept certain aspects of yourself, it's very hard to move beyond certain emotions and start accepting how others feel about you.
That's very true.
Yeah, I think Leroy is someone who is trapped in many ways in his own mind.
Yes. Yeah, this season 2 is definitely going to be about him exploring, now that him and Jacob have kind of separated a little bit, him more learning to just forgive himself, and love himself and all the parts, all the flaws that Jacob and his and Leroy's friends love about him.
Mhm. How about Jacob? Does he also struggle with disliking parts of himself?
I would say yes. I would say that Jacob probably struggles with he probably I'm trying to find a way to word it properly. He loves everyone and he loves everyone around him, and he never wants anyone around him to feel left out or sad. But and there's a line that'll be coming up in one of the episodes where Gwither says to him, "Well, what makes you happy?" And Jacob goes, "Well, making other people happy." Jacob
Mhm.
isn't necessarily he's very selfless. Um, but I think he would probably struggle with acceptance as well.
Is it in a
Accept
different way than Leroy?
Repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Does he struggle with accepting acceptance? Does he struggle with acceptance in a different way than Leroy struggles with that, or in a similar way?
Probably. When he was younger, he was very much considered weak and odd and much slower than most of his vampiric peers. So he probably feels like a bit of an outsider to his own kin, but not so much in the same way that Leroy feels that he is not lovable. Um, Jacob probably struggles with peer acceptance rather than love because he knows he's loved.
Hmm. And we see that in that episode with Edgar.
Yes, Edgar is a character who definitely broke through Jacob's insecurities and and may know some things about Jacob that not even Jacob wants to, wants to admit.
Hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about Edgar and what kind of character he is?
Sure. Edgar ironically started out as Jacob's negative emotions, and some people may have noticed that in the episode A Face in the Mirror. Um, and that's what he was going to be until he evolved past the Jekyll and Hyde. He's interesting. He can be crude, he can be cruel, he can be all the bad things that that people try to hide inside. It's almost like he's pulling it from them. He's a nightmare. He's a nightmare vampire hybrid, and he is uh, he is there to make you uncomfortable.
Yeah, we can definitely feel the discomfort that he causes in Jacob when he first appears. He's literally a nightmare in the sense that he causes people to question themselves so much.
Yeah, his powers. I haven't touched on them physically yet in the series, but his powers are the ability. It's like, let's say you want to go desecrate a building with some graffiti or something. He can literally motivate you to do that. But then there's that side of him is his Hyde. Is his Edward Hyde, because Edgar is actually much more timid than Victor.
Hmm. So how
So
is the more timid side of him like?
Edgar is much more cowardly. He's much more fragile. Um, Mentally speaking, he's just like, he wants his family back. He has a child he's trying to get to, but in terms of physicality and weakness, he just can't do it.
Hmm.
In the latest episode, I think it wasn't Never Alone, but it was the Edgar episode following that, where his companion Sirius suggests that they go to the house to confront Edgar's brother, but Edgar pretty much just shut down at that point, and Victor took over.
Hmm. So he can't really control this personality shift, can he?
No, it's very much out of his control, making Edgar more of a victim than a villain.
That's what I find so fascinating about him because when he's first introduced, he seems like a typical villain. But as we see more of his struggles and we understand that, he is the product of his environment and the things he's gone through, we realize he's just like everyone else.
Yeah, that was the thing too. I had teased that Edgar was going to be a villain worth reading, and that he wasn't going to be quite redeemable until the preceding factor of him having a child came in, and could have thrown a wrench into things, but I went with it, and it turned into this beautifully complex person dealing with a personality shift due to his own actions. And as you'll see in Tir Nanak, he may have had a hand in the creation of Victor.
Ah, I see.
Not necessarily because he wanted to. He may have had the best intent,
Mhm.
but it backfired on him.
Mhm. So what kind of ableist tropes are you challenging in your webtoon? Via what we see in the media, how do you think that your webtoon challenges certain ways that, people with disabilities are presented?
When you say ableist, you're talking about people who like refuse to see disabilities, like they're very anti disability. If I'm correct.
No, they're not really anti-disability. I think my point was that it's more like, how like some people say in the media, um it's more subtle. So basically it's like a presentation of certain people with disabilities in a patronizing way, for example, not as truly
Okay.
fleshed out people, but more as like a token or a trope, kind of how like ethnicity is sometimes tokenized in the media.
Okay. Oh, okay. Now that makes a lot more sense. Um, yeah, I would say that just like you said, in terms of trying to challenge ableist tropes, I would say definitely making characters like Jacob and Adar and Lucas, making my cast more fleshed out, emotionally speaking, personality wise, right off the bat too, is definitely a way to challenge what people think of when they think of those stereotypical and um, those very patronizing tropes.
Hmm. What do you think is an example of a patronizing trope that we usually see in the media about people with
Um,
disabilities?
I would say that they're a burden, and that to me is that's very very patron, or that their disability is a burden to those around them. Um, and that to me is very very sad that we would almost, I hate to use the word demonize because that's not the right word, but you know what I mean, that we would make it in such a way that it's a bad thing to have autism, or that okay, one thing I heard was like autism leads to social isolation. It
Hmm.
can if you don't take the proper steps to socialize, to help them socialize if they need it. But I don't necessarily think that that's true, because I knew plenty of people who were on the spectrum and in various spectrums who had plenty of friends.
Hmm.
So I would definitely say that's one that kind of sticks out to me.
Hmm. How about other types of disabilities, such as deafness, for example?
I definitely think that we need more deaf characters in media. I definitely think that there just needs to be more neurodivergency. We should probably be teaching ASL in schools. We should be teaching awareness. Not everyone who doesn't talk to you or doesn't respond to you isn't necessarily ignoring you. Awareness, compassion, and kindness is probably our greatest weapons against stuff like that.
Very true. I think, unfortunately, in mainstream media, people with disabilities are often just seen as tokens or, invisible in many senses. They're not seen as fully human in the sense that they're not fully developed as characters. They are just there as one-dimensional tokens or just in the background. They're never in the forefront.
Yeah, and even when they are, what's difficult about like writing stories with those who have disabilities is oftentimes it's those who are more neurotypical who are writing the stories. And I've seen it going around where it's like hashtag, actually autistic, use autistic voices. I really appreciated that in Shira, Entrapta was actually really inspired by by one of the storyboard writers who had autism. So it was really instrumental in that way. So I feel like if we had more people who were willing to use their neurodivergent voices to tell neurodivergent stories, we would see less one-dimensional characters and more fleshed out humans, not robots.
Exactly. What other kind of advice do you have for people who want to write stories about people who are neurodivergent or characters that have other types of disabilities?
I would say don't be afraid to explore them like you would any other character, because at the end of the day, even though they have a unique set of circumstances, it doesn't make them any less human, or any less supernatural. Whatever kind of character you are using to tell your story, as long as they are authentically and uniquely themselves, even with um, a disability, as long as you are telling that story from your experiences or the experiences you've seen of the people around you, I think I say go for it, because we definitely need it.
Mhm. I think it's also very important to keep in mind when we say that we want the character to be more human and more fleshed out, that also includes not putting them on a pedestal.
That's true. Don't Just because the character has a disability, that doesn't necessarily make them the exception to the rule. They should definitely experience the joys, the sorrows, the ups and downs. They're not superhuman. Unless that's your story, and that'd be kind of cool. But yeah, definitely make sure they go through the motions of life as well.
Mhm. Because I think one of the problems that a lot of people have sometimes is that they don't wanna be offensive, so they go the other way and make the character perfect.
Oh yeah. My cast is so far from perfect. Jacob, Leroy, Adar, they all make mistakes. Jacob and Leroy especially, they definitely make some mistakes as they go along. So yeah, definitely don't put them on a perfect pedestal. And don't the other thing too is no poor pity me. Um because I often feel like it's misunderstood that life is so hard because of your disability. No, life is equally as fulfilling. We just have our challenges from time to time, but it doesn't make my life miserable.
Mhm. Exactly. And the other way around is that, I think a disability doesn't make someone's life more inspiring. They're not there to serve as an inspirational story to other people.
Sure, I feel like I feel like people with disabilities are there to we're all here to do the best that we can. I find that the disability community is often filled with a lot of people who are very encouraging. So I feel like those stories definitely should be created to encourage other people with disabilities to, you know, what's the word? Not be afraid of who they are. That's
Mhm.
definitely one thing that I champion. Don't be afraid of who you are. Definitely be proud.
And that's what your characters also struggle to learn as they go through life. Both Leroy and Jacob, have to learn to accept themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm. So your work arguably counts as low fantasy, as we mentioned before, meaning it takes place in a world very similar to our own, but with some differences, such as Fae. We have dragons, vampires, and so on and so forth. What would
Yeah.
you say is the hardest part about writing low fantasy? And what is the easiest?
So, if I'm being honest, it's it. The hardest is probably people thinking that my world follows the rules and logic of the real world. It does not. There's one particular as moment where Jacob is in a classroom setting, and they're talking about the weaknesses of vampires, and Jacob mentions he has to have a quote unquote allergy shot when he's around roses because it can cause vampires to suffocate. I was
Mhm.
not implying that allergy shots are used to be are used as someone had pointed out that it was like immunotherapy, and I went that's true. What you're saying is factually true, but it doesn't make sense in vampires. It doesn't make sense in creatures that are considered supernatural. In them, it's more like a defensive agent. And I had to make sure I clarified that in the season 2 premiere because again, my world does not follow the logic of real life. So
Mhm.
that was probably the hardest part is trying to get people to almost suspend their disbelief of real world logic in favor of the world's logic.
Mhm.
The easiest part is I get to bend the rules and pretty much, create, do and say what I feel fits within the boundaries of my world.
Mhm. Yeah. What kind of advice would you have for people who want to write their own fantasy series? For example, some of my friends, such as my other co-host Tete, she's had some difficulties with her fantasy world building because she's overwhelmed by how many details have to go into it, and sometimes she's really scared of setting something up and saying, and then later on finding out that something else in her world building has contradicted that. What advice would you give people who are struggling with this?
What's so wonderful about world building is sometimes and I've done this too. I have another fantasy series I'm working on that um I sort of set the world building aside for a little while and focused more so on my characters and my story. What's World building is a tough subject, but I would say um sometimes there are details that are just not going to make it into your series. And you can only cover so much because mentally, yes, it's very stressing. And two, you never want to overwhelm your audience. That's the other thing too. You never want to, like we were saying the one time, info dump. You don't ever want to give like too much all at once because that can just lead to muddled plot lines. So definitely my advice would be decide what you think is most important. Definitely make a checklist of things you're like, okay, A needs to happen, B needs to happen, B C D. Go through the checklist of what's most important detail wise, and then if the other things that you want to cover come about later down the line, then they come about naturally more so than trying to put all your eggs into the basket at once.
Mhm. That's very good advice. I agree because last time in our episode from last week, we talked with a fantasy writer called Wanda Walker, who also said that she kind of just brushed aside world building sometimes and focused more on the characters. And then later on, she went back to the world building and thought about what her characters needed. Like, she was looking at her character stories and thinking about what she needed to bring in from all the ideas she had from her world building into the story to flesh her characters out more. So that's another way to approach world building, which you were also saying, should be sometimes more character focused when because you don't want to be too absorbed in the details.
Yeah, your story will almost get muddled and lost. I had someone who I was brainstorming with, and they were like, "Well, what about the world here? What's happening to this place over here?" I went, "That doesn't matter right now. What matters is the characters and what's happening with their story. I will build the world when I need to build the world. Right now, I just want to worry about what's happening with my main cast."
Mhm, mhm. Exactly. Especially if the story is like yours, very character focused and focused on their inner psychology and their character development.
Oh yeah, and that I learned a lot from listening to just like I listen to so many different people, so many different storytellers from the world of games to the world of comics to the world of manga to TV shows and movies. I absorbed whatever I could and then I just took all that advice and put it into one thing. And the one thing I consistently heard was in order to have a strong story, you need to have strong characters. And I'm very, very I champion character driven stories because it matters. It truly matters to have
Mhm.
well rounded protagonists.
I agree. I'm also a very big fan of character driven stories, and I'm a creator of one myself. And I think one of the reasons why I personally have always been drawn to character driven stories is because they explore and answer and, pose so many questions that we real everyday life people face. They are a reflection of ourselves and our struggles, and they can sometimes help us to think about the problems we have and feel better about the problems we have, and maybe come up with solutions to the problems we are currently facing.
That's true. Yeah, I often say it's funny. People talk about like don't do a self insert, but I feel like that's almost oxymoronic because you're writing based on your experiences and things that you yourself have gone through. They might just be a little bit more fictionalized. So you're
Exactly.
you're already doing a self-insert. You're just not calling it that.
There's nothing wrong with self-inserts, audience. I'm just saying, I'm putting it out there because I noticed that, like, on, sites, especially like 10 years ago when I was like 13 years old or 14, on places like DeviantArt, we've been told for countless of years that you should never write self-inserts. But what they were trying to say back then is kind of different from what we're saying right now as a self-insert, because back then I think they were talking and criticizing about characters who were like, they were not fleshed out. Like, these kind of self-inserts were just wish fulfillment. They were just in the story
Yeah,
so then they can get the perfect love interest and have everything handed over to them without working for it.
the
But when
Gary
we're
Mary
talking, yeah,
stew.
exactly, the Mary Sue or the Gary Stew. But when we're talking about self inserts in, what we just covered, we're talking about characters who are based on our own experiences and what we went through, which is a bit different. And I would say very different, actually, from the Mary Sue or the Gary Stew trope.
Yes.
Because a lot of these self insert characters that we're talking about go through a lot of struggles. They are far from perfect. They don't get everything handed to them like the Mary Sue or the Gary Stew supposedly does.
Yes.
Hmm. But
Yeah, I would agree with that.
yeah. And also another thing is that having a Gary Stew or a Mary Sue isn't necessarily the end of the world. I think a lot of creators or have been told over the internet especially that, oh, if you have, this kind of character, then it's really bad. But I don't think is really that bad. It's a starting point. Everyone has to start from somewhere, and I don't really think you can really just say, oh, because this character is a Mary Sue, we should never work with them again. Well, no, every character has to start from somewhere, and you can think more about how to make that character engaging, more human, and just more fleshed out and interesting. I think
Yeah, I
just
mean, if
labeling a character as Mary Sue and brushing him or her aside is not the way to go about it.
yeah, there is definitely a fine line, and that's an interesting thing too. I mean, if your character starts out as starts off in that, and then you decide to flesh them out further and further as the story goes along, I think that's fine. Having them have the perfect hair, perfect body, all that sort of stuff. But then, sort of branching out and giving them flaws because flaws are what make characters relatable. Um, then yeah, that's fine. It's fine as a starting point. Just make sure that you go beyond that.
Exactly. I think, a character needs to be dynamic and grow. And I mean, in order to be engaging, unless it's some kind of parody where, the whole story is a parody of something or some kind of
Yes.
commentary on something else or a satire. I mean, that's totally different. But in a
Oh
character,
yeah.
yeah,
Different setting.
It depends on what you want with the story. I mean, as the creator, you get to decide for yourself what you want to achieve with your character.
I agree with that, yeah. And that's the wonderful thing about being an author. An author in some regard, you get to decide, exactly what your character is going to go through and how.
Exactly. Anything else you want to tell us about chaotic idiots and the process of creation in general?
Um, hmm. I felt like there was. Did we get through all our questions?
Yes, I think we did.
Well, I guess my hope for chaotic idiots is that people find it enjoyable. That I'm doing my disability representation right. I hope people will enjoy its prequel as well. And oh, I know. You would ask me if I wanted to talk about about those who want to start a webtoon.
Oh, yes, yes. We can talk about that as well.
So the one thing I want to say, and this is something that I don't think I've seen very many people talk about, is when you start a webtoon, it is not going to be sunshine, rainbow, and everybody's going to love your story. As harsh as that sounds, because not many people liked Chaotic Idiots when it was in its first incarnation. They
Mhm.
did not like my story. And another thing too, you may get a lot of negative comments, but the one thing that really matters at the end of the day is who are you writing this story for? Because if you're writing it for to please the audience that you get, even though that's a wonderful thing, you want to have people like your story. But if you're writing it for them, you really should not start making a webtoon because it's not no it's just a common saying. Not everybody's going to love your work. Eventually, you will find people who are going to like that. So I definitely would say to anyone who wants to start a webtoon, go in there knowing that it's not going to be an easy uphill journey. It's definitely going to be a battle. It certainly was for me.
Mm.
Don't let self doubts defeat you, because most of the time your own thoughts are the worst enemy you actually have. It's not other people. Um, and don't be afraid to tell your story. And I think that's the best thing I could give to somebody is definitely don't be afraid to tell your story, because if it's something you love and are passionate about, it's worth telling.
I totally agree. Yeah, especially if you are trying to aim for like a weekly release, like some of these webtoons are, they have an update every week. You really need to set a schedule and think about what you want to achieve with your webcomic rather than just go along with what your audience or what you think your audience wants. Because at
Yeah,
that point, you need to motivate yourself. You can't rely on the audience to motivate you.
yeah, because uh, a lot of times they're just not going to. So I heard a webtoon creator say this. They were like, you have to be happy making something for yourself rather than for an audience.
Hmm. I agree. And that goes not only for webtoon, but novel writing, art, and honestly, any kind of content creation.
Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. This was incredible.
Thank you so much for coming on. We had such a great time talking about your comic and the themes that are in it and, the importance of disability representation.
Absolutely, it is. It's something that I hope in the future we'll see more characters. Whether it's autism or deafness or cerebral palsy or what have you in terms of disability that's out there. Because it's such a vast spectrum, and we just need more. We need to normalize neurodivergency.
Exactly. Thank you so much again. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.